Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. This happened during a solo hitchhiking trip through the backroads of Louisiana. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I know that sounds like it doesn't make sense, especially since this story mostly takes place on a lonely stretch of US Route 90, but you have to understand why I was out there in the first place. I had been renting this small, elevated house on the outskirts of Lafayette for about 3 months, trying to save money while working odd jobs. It was a cheap place, surrounded by cypress trees and a lot of empty space, which I usually liked. But during that last week, things in the house started to feel very wrong. It started with small things, like finding the kitchen cabinets wide open when I knew I'd closed them before bed. Then it escalated to the sound of floorboards creaking in the hallway while I was lying perfectly still in the dark. I lived alone, and I didn't have any pets, so there was no logical explanation for the weight I could hear shifting outside my door. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night around 7:45 p.m., when I saw a reflection in my darkened TV screen of someone standing right behind my couch. I didn't even look back, I just grabbed my jacket and my bag and bolted out the front door. I didn't have a car at the time because the transmission had blown 2 weeks prior and I couldn't afford the repairs yet. My plan was to get to a friend's place in Lake Charles, but I was panicked and wasn't thinking clearly. I just started walking toward the main highway, hoping I could catch a ride and put as much distance between me and that house as possible. By the time I reached the shoulder of Route 90, the sun was almost completely gone. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of humid heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin within minutes. A low, gray fog was starting to crawl out from the flooded ditches that line the road. It's a very specific kind of silence out there in the marshland at dusk. You hear the frogs and the insects, but they seem to highlight how empty the actual road is. I stood by a rusted guardrail, stuck my thumb out, and waited for the first pair of headlights to cut through the gloom. I started walking west, figured I might as well keep moving while I waited for a ride. To keep my mind off the person I thought I saw in my living room, I started paying attention to the mile markers. I passed a small green sign that said 142. It was slightly bent and covered in some kind of dark moss or grime. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8:12 p.m. and I felt a small sense of progress. If I could just get a few miles down the road, I'd feel a lot safer. About 10 minutes passed and I hadn't seen a single car. The fog was getting thicker, turning the world into a blur of gray and dark green. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder until I saw another mile marker coming up in the distance. I expected it to say 141 or maybe even stay at 142 if I hadn't gone far enough. But as I got closer, I realized it was the exact same sign I had passed before. It was bent at the same angle, and the moss was in the exact same spot. I stopped for a second, looking back the way I came. I thought maybe I had gotten turned around in the fog, but that was impossible. The road was a straight line, and the ditch was on my right side the entire time. I shook my head, thinking I was just tired and stressed out from the situation at the house. I kept walking, moving a bit faster this time. I walked for what felt like another mile, my heart rate starting to pick up as the darkness truly settled in. I saw the next sign emerging from the mist. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the numbers, 142. I walked right up to it and touched the cold metal. It was the same sign. I even noticed a specific scratch near the bottom that looked like a jagged letter M. I looked down at the ditch beside it. There was a discarded, muddy tire half submerged in the water, exactly where it had been the first time I saw this marker. At this point, a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down my spine. I checked my watch again. It was 8:34 p.m. I had been walking for over 20 minutes, but according to the road, I hadn't moved an inch. I felt like I was on a treadmill or like the world around me was being swapped out while I wasn't looking. I decided to try something different. I crossed the road to the eastbound side, thinking maybe the markers on that side would be different. I started jogging back toward Lafayette just to see if I could reach the previous marker. I ran for about 5 minutes, my lungs burning in the humid air. The fog was so dense now that I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Finally, a shape appeared in the gloom. It wasn't marker 143, it was marker 142. The same bent post, the same moss, and the same muddy tire in the ditch, even though I was now on the opposite side of the road. I stood in the middle of the highway waiting for the sound of an engine, a siren, or anything that proved the rest of the world still existed. The silence was absolute. Even the frogs and crickets had gone quiet. It felt like I was standing in a vacuum. Then I finally heard it, a faint, low humming sound coming from behind me. I turned around and saw 2 dim, yellow headlights approaching through the fog. They were moving incredibly slowly, almost like the car was searching for something. I didn't even care who it was at that point. I just wanted off that stretch of road. I stepped into the light and waved my arms frantically. The vehicle was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind with wood paneling on the sides that you don't see much anymore. It slowed down even more and eventually came to a crawl right next to me. The engine sounded rough, like it was struggling to stay running. The passenger side window stayed rolled up, and I couldn't see through the glass because of the heavy tint and the grime. I walked up to the door and tapped on the window. "Hey, I really need a lift," I said, my voice sounding thin and shaky in the open air. "I'm trying to get to Lake Charles, or at least the next town." There was no response from inside. I couldn't even tell if there was a person in the driver's seat. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it clicked open. A wave of stale, cold air hit me. It smelled like old newspapers and wet earth. I hesitated for a second, but the sight of that mile marker 142 just a few feet away made me jump in. I sat in the passenger seat and closed the door. The interior was incredibly cramped. There were stacks of old mail and maps piled up on the floorboards, reaching all the way to my knees. I looked over at the driver. He was wearing a heavy flannel jacket and a baseball cap pulled down low. He didn't look at me. He just kept his hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead. "Thanks for stopping," I said, trying to be polite despite how weird the situation was. The driver didn't say anything. He just shifted the car into gear and we started moving. I looked at the dashboard, but none of the gauges were working. The speedometer stayed at 0 even as we picked up speed. I looked out the window, watching for the mile markers to change. We passed one, then another. Both of them said 142. My stomach did a slow flip. I looked at the driver again. His hands were extremely pale, almost white, and he wasn't moving them at all, even as the road curved slightly. He just sat there like a statue. I started to feel that same sense of dread I had felt back at the house, only this time I was trapped in a moving vehicle. I checked my watch, but the hands weren't moving anymore. It was stuck at 8:47 p.m. "Can you pull over?" I asked, my hand moving toward the door handle. "I think I forgot something." The driver still didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I realized then that the humming sound I heard earlier wasn't coming from the engine. It was coming from the driver himself. He was making a low, constant vibration in his throat. It sounded like a person trying to scream with their mouth sewn shut. I lunged for the door handle and pulled it, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was welded shut. I started to panic, slamming my shoulder against the door. "Let me out, stop the car," I yelled. I looked out the windshield and saw that the fog had turned into a solid white wall. We weren't even on the highway anymore. The asphalt was gone, replaced by a narrow dirt path lined with dead trees. The car wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was accelerating. I turned to the driver and grabbed his shoulder, intending to shake him, but as soon as my hand touched the flannel, the jacket collapsed. There was no body inside. The clothes were stuffed with old, damp newspapers and some kind of foul-smelling straw. The baseball cap fell back, revealing nothing but a hollow space where a head should have been. I screamed and scrambled toward the back seat, but the car was filled with so much junk I couldn't move. The humming sound grew louder and louder, vibrating through the entire frame of the car until my teeth started to ache. Then everything went black. I don't mean I fainted, I mean the light simply vanished. I felt a sudden, violent jolt, like the car had hit a wall or dropped off a cliff. I braced for an impact that never came. Instead, I felt a rush of cold air and the smell of swamp water. I opened my eyes and found myself lying face down in a flooded ditch. I scrambled to my feet, soaking wet and shivering. I was back on the shoulder of Route 90. I looked around wildly for the car, but the road was empty. The fog was still there, but it felt thinner now. I looked to my left and saw a green sign. It was mile marker 142. My heart sank, thinking I was still trapped in the loop. But then I heard the sound of a real engine, the high-pitched whine of a modern semi-truck. I saw the bright LED headlights approaching, and this time they weren't yellow or dim. The truck slowed down as it saw me standing there, dripping wet and looking like a ghost. The driver, a middle-aged man who looked very confused, opened the door and asked if I was okay. I didn't even explain, I just begged him to take me to the next town. He let me in, and as we drove away, I watched the mile markers carefully. 141, 140, 139. I almost cried with relief as the numbers finally started to change. The trucker dropped me off at a gas station in a small town about 20 miles away. I called my friend, and he came to pick me up around 11:15 p.m. I stayed at his place for a week, too terrified to go back to my rental. I eventually hired a moving company to get my things, telling them I had an emergency and couldn't be there. They didn't find anyone in the house, but they did mention one weird thing when they delivered my boxes. They told me that when they entered the house, all the furniture had been moved into the center of the living room to face the TV. And on the TV screen, someone had taped a small, rectangular piece of metal. When I opened the small envelope they handed me, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a small, rusted metal plate with the number 142 embossed on it. It looked like it had been ripped right off a signpost. I never went back to that part of Louisiana, and I never hitchhiked again. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night and the fog starts to roll in, I find myself staring at the mile markers, terrified that the next one I see will have that same jagged scratch and the mossy edges. Because I still don't know if I ever truly left that stretch of road, or if I'm just waiting for the car with the wood paneling to come back for its passenger.
story too.
It was the first night in the Ames countryside I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is L. Whitman, and this happened about 3 years ago when I moved out to Iowa for a research job. I had grown up in a busy part of Chicago, so the idea of wide open spaces and quiet nights sounded like a dream come true. I found a small, cheap rental house about 20 minutes outside of the main city. It was surrounded by nothing but cornfields and gravel roads that didn't even have names on GPS. The first few days were fine, but the isolation started to get to me faster than I expected. On that specific Tuesday, I had stayed late at the university library to finish some data entry. By the time I headed home, it was already getting dark. I was driving my old sedan, a car that had seen much better days, and I was tired. About 5 miles away from my house, the engine started to sputter. I tried to give it some gas, but the car just lurched forward and then died completely. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the rutted gravel road, feeling a sinking sensation in my chest. I sat there for a minute staring at the dashboard and hoping it was just a fluke. I tried turning the key again, but all I got was a clicking sound. I checked my phone and of course I had no service. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon now, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. I knew I couldn't just sit in the car all night because the temperature was dropping fast. I decided my best bet was to start walking toward my house and hope a neighbor or a passing truck would see me. The walk was grueling, the gravel was uneven, and every step felt like it was echoing across the flat landscape. On both sides of me, the corn was tall and dried out, making a constant papery rustling sound in the wind. It was about 8:45 p.m. when I first saw the barn. It was a massive, collapsing red structure sitting maybe 50 yards back from the road. The wood was gray and rotting, and the windows were all smashed out. Even in the dim light, it looked like a jagged tooth sticking out of the earth. As I got closer to the barn, the wind seemed to die down, but the noise didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. It wasn't the rustling of corn anymore. It sounded like a low, rhythmic humming. I slowed my pace, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. I told myself it was probably just some farm equipment or maybe a generator running in the distance. But there were no lights on the property, and the barn looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I kept my head down and tried to pick up the pace, focusing on the white gravel under my feet. That's when I saw headlights reflecting in the dust ahead of me. A pickup truck was crawling down the road, moving so slowly it was almost stationary. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I waved my arms, hoping they would see me in the dark. The truck, an old, beat-up Chevy, pulled up alongside me and came to stop. The engine was loud and chugging, and the smell of diesel filled the air. The driver's side window rolled down, but only halfway. The man behind the wheel looked like he was in his late 60s. He was wearing a dirty baseball cap and his face was deeply lined, but it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me. It was his expression. He looked absolutely terrified. He didn't ask if I needed a jump or if I was okay. He just leaned over toward the passenger door and shoved it open. "Get in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And whatever you do, do not look back at that barn, just look at the floor." I didn't ask questions. Something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. I hopped into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. The interior of the truck smelled like stale tobacco and old leather. As soon as I was in, the man put the truck in gear and started driving. He wasn't speeding, though. He kept the truck at a steady, agonizingly slow crawl. I wanted to tell him to floor it to get us away from that place, but the tension in the cab was so thick I couldn't find my voice. "Why are we going so slow?" I finally managed to ask. The man didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Noise," he muttered. "If we go too fast, the tires kick up too much gravel. They like the sound of the gravel. It draws them out." I didn't know who they were, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I looked down at my feet just like he told me, focusing on a crumpled fast food bag on the floorboard. That was when the chanting started. It wasn't the low humming I had heard before. It was much clearer now. It sounded like dozens of voices all speaking in unison, but the language was nothing I recognized. It was guttural and sharp, rising and falling in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded like it was coming from the fields right next to the truck. I could hear the corn stalks snapping, as if people were moving through them, keeping pace with us. I felt a sudden, intense urge to look out the window. It's that weird human instinct where you know you shouldn't do something, but the curiosity becomes almost painful. I kept my eyes on the floor, but the chanting was getting louder. It was roughly 9:15 p.m. now, and the darkness outside felt heavy and suffocating. The driver was shaking. I could see his hands trembling on the wheel. He started whispering a prayer under his breath, over and over again. "They're coming out of the barn," the driver whispered almost to himself. "Don't look, kid, please, for the love of God, don't look." I tried to obey him, I really did, but then something hit the side of the truck. It wasn't a hard impact, but more like a soft, wet thud. Then came another one and another. It sounded like someone was throwing heavy, damp rags against the metal door. The chanting reached a fever pitch, sounding like it was right outside my window. I couldn't help it. My head turned before I could stop myself. I glanced back over my shoulder toward the red barn we were leaving behind. In the faint glow of the truck's taillights, I saw them. There was a group of people, maybe 20 or 30 of them, standing in a perfect circle in the clearing in front of the barn. They were all wearing long, heavy coats that looked like they were made of burlap or raw wool, but it was their faces that stopped my heart. They weren't wearing masks, at least I don't think they were. Their faces looked smooth and pale, like unbaked dough with no visible eyes or mouths. They were all leaning back, their heads tilted toward the sky, and even though they had no mouths, the chanting was clearly coming from them. In the center of the circle, there was something tall and dark made of twisted wood and corn husks. It looked like a crude, giant version of a human, and it was slowly being raised toward the hayloft of the barn. The driver must have seen me look because he suddenly slammed his foot on the gas. The truck roared to life and the tires spun in the gravel, sending a spray of stones backward. The sudden movement threw me against the seat. I looked back one more time before the dust cloud obscured everything. One of the figures had broken the circle. It was standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, watching us drive away. It didn't have a face, but I felt its gaze like a physical weight on my chest. We drove in total silence for the next 10 minutes. The driver didn't slow down until we reached the main paved highway that led into Ames. He pulled over at a bright, well-lit gas station and put the truck in park. He stayed like that for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel and breathing heavily. I wanted to thank him, but I was shaking so hard I could barely move my jaw. I reached into my pocket and realized I finally had cell service again. "You saw them, didn't you?" the man asked. His voice was flat and hollow. I didn't know how to answer. I just nodded slowly. He turned to look at me for the first time, and his eyes were bloodshot and watering. "I lost my son to that barn 10 years ago," he said. "He went out for a walk and never came back. Every year around this time, they come out to finish what they started. You're lucky you weren't out there 10 minutes later." I didn't know what to say to that. I got out of the truck, and the man didn't wait for a goodbye. He just drove off into the night, leaving me standing under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the gas station. I called a cab and went back to my car the next morning with a tow truck. The car was exactly where I left it, but there was something different. When I got close to the driver's side door, I saw a series of handprints smeared in dried mud across the window. They weren't normal handprints. The fingers were far too long, and there were no palm lines. I didn't stay in that house for much longer. I broke my lease and moved back into the city, even though it cost me a lot of money I didn't have. I never went back to that stretch of road, and I never looked for that barn again. But sometimes, when it's late at night and the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment, I think I can hear that low, rhythmic chanting. It makes me wonder what would have happened if that truck hadn't shown up when it did. The weirdest part happened about a month ago. I was cleaning out my old backpack when I found a small, dried-up piece of corn husk tucked into the side pocket. I haven't been near a cornfield since that night. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I had ever touched the corn while I was walking. I didn't, but as I unfolded the husk, I realized there was something written on the inside in a dark, brownish stain. It was just one word: soon. I haven't slept well since then. Every time I close my eyes, I see that faceless figure standing in the middle of the gravel road, just waiting. I don't go for walks at night anymore, and I always make sure my windows are locked tight, because I know that out there in the dark, in the middle of those silent Iowa fields, the barn is still standing. And I have a feeling that whatever is inside it is still waiting for me to look back one last time. Story 3. Back in the summer of 2016, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. My name is Darius, and at the time I was living in a small, dusty town in Nevada, right on the edge of what people call the loneliest road in America. US Route 50 is a long, desolate stretch of highway that cuts through the desert and over high mountain passes. If your car breaks down out there, you're basically on your own for hours, maybe even days. I worked at a Chevron station about 20 miles outside of the nearest actual town. My shift usually ended at 4 a.m., which meant I was driving home in the absolute darkest part of the night. I drove an old, beat-up Honda Civic that had seen much better days. My parents always told me I needed to get the transmission looked at, but I was 20 years old and didn't have the money to spare. I figured as long as it got me from point A to point B, I was fine. One Tuesday night, or I guess Wednesday morning, things went south. I had just finished a long shift and was heading back toward my apartment. It was about 4:15 a.m. when I started heading up a steep mountain pass. The air was unusually cold for a Nevada summer, and a thick mist was rolling off the peaks. Suddenly my engine made a horrible grinding sound, the dashboard lights flickered, and everything just died. I managed to coast the car onto the narrow shoulder of the road. I tried turning the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't even click. I checked my phone, and of course there was absolutely zero service. I was stuck in the middle of a mountain pass with no one around and no way to call for help. I sat there for about 20 minutes, hoping a truck or another traveler would pass by, but Route 50 is called the loneliest road for a reason. Eventually, the cold started seeping through the glass of my windows. I realized that sitting in a dead car was a good way to freeze until the sun came up. I decided my best bet was to start walking back toward the town I had just left. It was about 12 miles away, which was a long hike, but I figured I might catch a signal if I got to higher ground. I grabbed my flashlight, locked my car, and started walking along the edge of the asphalt. The silence of the Nevada desert at night is something you can't really describe. There are no crickets or birds, just the sound of the wind whistling through the sagebrush and the crunch of your own boots on the gravel. Every time I heard a rock shift or a bush rustle, I would shine my light into the darkness. I was mostly worried about mountain lions or coyotes, but the deeper I got into the pass, the more I felt like something else was watching me. I had been walking for about 45 minutes when I saw faint lights in the distance behind me. My heart jumped because I thought it was finally a person coming to help. I stopped and waited, watching the twin beams of light slowly wind their way up the mountain road. They were moving at a very steady, almost mechanical pace. As the vehicle got closer, I stepped out onto the shoulder and stuck my thumb out, waving my flashlight a little so they would see me. The car was a dark, older model sedan, maybe something from the late 90s. It didn't look like much, just a generic four-door car with faded black paint. As it approached, it slowed down perfectly and came to a smooth stop right next to me. The engine was humming quietly, and the headlights were bright enough that I had to squint. I walked up to the passenger side window, expecting to see a local or maybe a truck driver taking a shortcut. The windows were heavily tinted, so I couldn't see inside at all. I tapped on the glass and waited for the driver to roll it down so I could ask for a ride. Instead of the window rolling down, I heard the distinct sound of the power locks clicking open. I waited for a second, expecting a voice to tell me to get in, but there was nothing but the sound of the idling engine. I figured the driver was just being cautious and didn't want to roll the window down in the cold. I pulled the handle and opened the door. "Hey, thanks so much for stopping," I said as I climbed into the front seat. My car broke down about 3 miles back and I really need to get to a phone. I sat down and pulled the door shut, shivering from the cold air outside. I turned my head to look at the driver to thank them properly, but my heart stopped. The driver's seat was completely empty. I froze, my hand still gripping the door handle. I looked into the back seat, thinking maybe the owner was sitting back there for some reason, but the car was entirely vacant. The engine was still running, and the heater was blowing warm air into the cabin. I looked down at the floorboards on the driver's side. I watched as the gas pedal slowly depressed all by itself, and the gear shifter clicked firmly into drive. Panic set in immediately. I reached for the door handle to get out, but as soon as the car started moving, I heard the locks click again. I pulled on the handle as hard as I could, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the lock was being held down by a motor that was stronger than me. The car began to accelerate, picking up speed as it moved further up the mountain pass. I started screaming, "Stop the car, let me out," but there was no one to hear me. The most terrifying part wasn't just that the car was moving, it was the steering wheel. It was spinning and turning with total precision, navigating the sharp curves of the mountain road as if an expert driver were behind the wheel. I watched the leather-wrapped rim slide through invisible hands, making micro-adjustments to keep us perfectly in the center of the lane. The speedometer climbed to 50, then 60 miles per hour. I tried to grab the steering wheel myself, thinking I could force the car off the road or into a ditch just to make it stop. But when I touched it, the wheel felt like it was made of solid lead. It wouldn't move an inch in my hands. It was like I was fighting against a hydraulic system that was far more powerful than any human. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the radio suddenly flickered to life, filling the car with loud, screeching static. I looked over at the dashboard and noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock on the dash wasn't moving. It was stuck at 4:33 a.m. every time I looked at it. It just blinked 4:33 a.m. over and over. I started banging on the window, hoping that by some miracle someone would see me, but we were in the middle of nowhere. The car was heading higher and higher into the pass, away from the town and deeper into the wilderness. I decided I had to break the window. I looked around the floor for anything heavy, but the car was unnaturally clean. There wasn't a single piece of trash, no loose change, not even a floor mat. I took off my heavy boot and started slamming the heel of it against the passenger side window. I hit it as hard as I could, but the glass didn't even chip. It felt like I was hitting a wall of reinforced steel instead of a normal car window. As we reached the summit of the pass, the car began to speed up even more. We were doing 75 miles per hour on a road that was designed for 40. The tires were screaming as we hit the turns, and I was being thrown against the door. I looked at the empty driver's seat again, and for a split second, I swear I saw an indentation in the fabric. It looked like the weight of a person was sitting there, pressing down into the foam of the chair. Suddenly, the car slammed on the brakes. I was thrown forward, nearly hitting the dashboard as the vehicle skidded to a halt in the middle of the road. The silence returned, even more heavy than before. The engine was still idling, but the static on the radio had stopped. We were parked right on the edge of a steep drop-off where the guardrail had been smashed away from a previous accident. I sat there gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried the door handle one more time, and to my shock, it clicked open. I didn't wait a second. I scrambled out of the car and tumbled onto the cold asphalt, rolling away from the vehicle as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was several yards away, hidden behind a large boulder on the side of the road. I watched the car, waiting for something to happen. For about a minute, the car just sat there with its lights shining into the abyss of the canyon. Then the passenger door, which I had left wide open, slowly swung shut on its own. I heard the lock click one last time. The car shifted back into gear and began to drive forward. It didn't turn around or continue down the road. Instead, it slowly drove straight off the edge of the cliff, where the guardrail was missing. I waited for the sound of a crash. I waited for an explosion or the sound of metal hitting the rocks below, but there was nothing, no sound at all. I crept toward the edge of the drop-off and looked down into the darkness. I shined my flashlight down the steep embankment, expecting to see the wreckage of the black sedan at the bottom, but the canyon floor was empty. There was no car, no debris, and no sign that anything had ever gone over the edge. I spent the rest of the night huddled behind that boulder, too terrified to move. I didn't care about the cold anymore, I just wanted the sun to come up. Around 5:45 a.m., a state trooper finally drove by and saw me waving frantically. I told him my car had broken down and I had gotten lost in the dark. I didn't tell him about the black sedan or the empty driver's seat. I knew how crazy I would sound. The trooper was nice enough to give me a ride to the next town. As we drove past the spot where the guardrail was missing, I asked him if there had been many accidents there. He nodded and told me that a few years back, a young man had gone over the edge in a black car during a bad storm. He told me they never found the body or the vehicle because the canyon was too deep and the brush was too thick in that specific area. I eventually got my car towed and fixed, but I quit that night shift job the very next week. I moved back to the city where there are more people and fewer lonely roads. Every now and then when I'm driving late at night, I'll see a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror that look just a little too steady. I never slow down and I never ever stop for anyone. I still think about that blinking clock sometimes. Whenever I see the time 4:33 a.m. on my phone or a digital clock, I feel a cold draft on my neck. I can still hear the sound of those power locks clicking shut, trapping me inside. I don't know what would have happened if that car hadn't decided to let me out before it went over the edge. I just know that some things on Route 50 aren't looking for a passenger. They're looking for someone to take the fall with them.